Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our series of lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the response of the Tao. Last week, we started talking about this particular misdeed of enjoying leisure and amusement beyond measure. Today, I'd like to continue to explore this from the Confucian and Buddhist perspectives, because as we may know and experience, generally we like to enjoy life. We want to enjoy ourselves. But quite strangely, many of these texts, these ancient texts, whether it's from the Taoist, Confucian, or Buddhist perspective, warn us about this. And in fact, it's almost unanimous when it comes to the sacred texts of these philosophical traditions. So it'd be interesting to explore this and understand why it is that they're telling us to sort of keep our leisure, our entertainment, amusement in check. So first of all, the Confucian perspective. And in the Records on Ritual, which is one of the 5 classics of the Confucian tradition, there is this particular extract that is taken from the very first chapter, in fact, part of the opening passage of the Records on Ritual. You can see that it talks about 4 mental states, so pride, desires, emotions, and pleasure. And I've highlighted the lines about desires and pleasure because that relates to what has been written in the Exalted Treatise. We all have pride, desires, emotions, and this need to, be happy, to seek happiness. But as you can see, all of the lines relate to the idea of keeping them in check. So desires should not be indulged, should not be followed. Yes, we may have the desire for certain foods, etc., but that doesn't mean we always have to follow these desires. Pleasure should not be carried to excess, which directly reflects those lines in the Exalted Treatise, which tells us that, yes, we can enjoy ourselves, but not to the point of excess. So, as they say, a little bit tips the scale. And, this being one of the key, part of the Confucian canon, you could say, sort of begs the question, what did the Confucians think? Why did they say this? So the underlying principle can be found in this one of several texts. The first we'll look at is called the Discourses of the States. And this particular text was sort of compiled, I think, in around the 5th century BCE, around the times of, Confucius, or after the times of Confucius, that period. And this particular extract is also recorded in the Exemplary Women of Early China, because it's spoken by a well-known mother of a senior minister in the state of Lu, the state in which Confucius was born. So what she's trying to relate is this, it's a well-known concept or principle. And she talks about how in the past, the sage kings, how they governed the people by settling them in certain areas, putting them to work, giving them employment. And this idea of leisure versus labor. So in this case, it's idleness versus labor. So it says here that in the second, the second part, when people labor, they become thoughtful. Through this thoughtfulness, they develop goodness. Now, this is not, it seems logical, but the steps probably need to be explained. So how does labor lead to thoughtfulness? And this thoughtfulness is not, how to think your way out of work or to find shortcuts to the hard work. But actually this labor refers to the the thoughtfulness from labor refers to the idea that you think more of others. You become more considerate. Now, how does that work? Well, when we go through, when we put in the hard yards, when we put in our efforts in something, and we experience this, exhaustion, perhaps even pain and suffering, then we're more able to relate to other people who might be going through the same thing. A very simple example. So let's say, for example, I cook every day, and I cook for my family, and so when there's a day where someone can cook for me, I'm particularly grateful, and that's because I know that because they've in their in preparing the meal, they've had to put in work too. That they've had to plan, they've had to buy the groceries, and then plan the different steps, and ultimately put it together for the guests. So because you've done that, you've experienced that yourself, then you're more able to relate to others, and then following that step, you're more able to empathize and be considerate of others. So, this idea of becoming thoughtful is thinking of how others might be getting along, if they were in the same position as you, and therefore you develop this goodness, this kindness when you put yourself in others' shoes, and then because of that you are more sensitive to their pain, their suffering, their state of mind. And it's this sensitivity and this idea of helping people, preventing people from suffering, that is really that heart of compassion. And that's where this goodness stems from. In the Confucian perspective, it's the idea of humanity or benevolence, in Chinese pronounced as Ren. So this is the logical progression from labor to thoughtfulness and then to goodness, this development of virtue. On the other hand, idleness is when you're not working, and because that's in such instances, people often feel bored. They try to entertain themselves. Through this entertaining themselves, it's not usually through hard work, obviously, and they become dissolute. They indulge themselves, and they forget goodness. They forget goodness because they start only thinking about themselves and what they want to enjoy life, to entertain themselves, to etc. And hence develop hearts that are unkind because they forget that perhaps the things that they demand of others could actually be detrimental and put others in harm's way. They're only thinking about themselves and their own happiness. So that's how this idea of idleness leads to a dissolute lifestyle, this extravagant, wasteful lifestyle that then leads to unkindness. And then you can see here it concludes by talking about fertile land versus infertile land, and how because people have to work the land versus living a life of idleness, then they tend towards virtue or otherwise. Now, for many of us, this idea of working the land is not necessarily something that we can relate to, but I'm sure if we replace the words fertile land with people of wealthy background, a wealthy family, members of a wealthy family become dissolute versus members of a poorer family tend to be more hardworking. Now, we can probably understand this. Now, obviously, it's not clear-cut. There are many factors, for example, how parents may educate their children, how the children then encounter good teachers or mentors later in life, that they can also develop themselves towards goodness. But this is sort of the general principle, and that's this idea of why leisure, amusement has to be kept in check, because we don't want to lead onwards to this dissolute lifestyle and then ultimately selfishness. So that's one of the ideas. Another idea of why it is that leisure and amusement has to be sort of kept in check, comes from a very famous passage in the Mencius. So Mencius here explains, people often experience tough times, okay, and he sort of puts it in the perspective of, before you undertake some great responsibility, some great task, perhaps it could be, a career change, a career promotion. What often happens is that you will experience some difficulty first. He explains it very thoroughly. He says, first, you will suffer in your mind and your will. So perhaps there's some mental agony. There's something inside that sort of affects you emotionally. But also it might affect you physically, cause you physical exhaustion, toils their sinews and bones. Perhaps you have to work all-nighters. Perhaps you have to, travel some distance. And therefore it exhausts you on a physical level as well as a mental level. But beyond that, you may also experience a kind of difficulty that comes with, unfavorable conditions. So not only are you emotionally drained, you're physically drained, but also the conditions that you're in, maybe your living conditions are such that you are tested as well. Perhaps, there's no one to cook, you have to actually, getting groceries is difficult, so perhaps meals may be more simple, etc. So hence this idea of hunger, even poverty, your financial resources are drained or strained. And, things that you do are unsuccessful, your own projects. And so it's like, this misfortune comes not, one by one, but almost, everything seems to be going wrong. Okay, so on the inside, on the outside, and this is, when you're really tested. Okay, and Mencius is trying to tell us that explains that this is when you are actually about to experience something, great fortune. So why is it that you have to experience the suffering first? He says, well, through this, your mind is stimulated. When you meet with some sort of difficulty in your work, you have to think through it. There's problem solving. You have to think your way out of it. And as a result, you become more resilient to stress, to pressure, etc. You're strengthened. You grow. You get out of your comfort zone. You realize your inadequacies. Perhaps there's knowledge and skill sets that needs to be more developed. And therefore, this idea of being repaired means that you improve. And when you commonly make mistakes, you make mistakes more frequently, you're able to learn from those mistakes, those lessons, and avoid that in the future. So actually, you're growing, and you grow faster when you experience this kind of things going wrong in your life. And yes, you might be troubled, you might be confused, but it's through that you become more capable of in your work, when other areas of your life. So Mencius is saying that actually the suffering, these hardships, are not necessarily a bad thing. This might be from the perspective of an individual, but he's actually thinking about it in terms of, a leader of a state. And he's saying that, well, this leader has to have these families, law-abiding families, but also worthy counselors. Now, what does he mean by a worthy counselor? Is someone who actually challenges you, who actually tells you when you're wrong, who sort of questions your strategy so that you can improve it. And, you have to have people who challenge you to think of things from a different perspective, as well as perhaps, as it says here, states, so neighbouring countries, neighbouring governments who may want to invade you. They're hostile. Why is that? is because with this, a government that has its internal checks, these challenges, but also external challenges, then you, as the leader, you implement strategies that will create a stronger state. Maybe improve your defenses through the challenges of this worthy counselor. You realize that your policies need to be improved, etc. So without these things, then the state will often perish. And from the perspective of a leader, without these things, wouldn't that be great? If all of my policies just were, went through without any protest, without any kind of opposition, wouldn't it be great if there was no threat from other countries? No, that's great, but it leads to complacency. And that's why perhaps, if you were in that time, the Mencius lived in the Warring States period. So as you can tell, it was a period in which there was a lot of wars between the states. And therefore, if you were not prepared, then the neighboring state, who would probably be allied with other states, they would attack you unawares. And because you were not prepared, you would perish. And so the conclusion is that we actually thrive as individuals, as at the state level. We actually thrive when we experience some sort of calamity or setback. And actually we perish, we become weaker. We weaken our defenses. We are more complacent when we are just experiencing comfort and joy all the time. So then this leads back to why the Exalted Treatise is telling us that in the good times, as say we've got a lot of money, we've got a lot of friends, we've got a successful career, everything is great. But it's in these times of comfort and joy that you actually have to keep things in check. In this way, you continue developing, you continue improving yourself. But when you encounter this misfortune in any way, think of it as an opportunity to grow and to become more resilient and to strengthen yourself. So that's what Mencius is saying. And that provides us with another idea as to why it is that these Confucian texts also, provided the same idea that leisure and entertainment, comfort, joy, etc., these need to be curbed. But when we look at it from a Confucian perspective, again, it's something that is sort of thinks from a different level. So the Confucian perspective, taking the words of Mencius, this idea of sorrow and calamity versus comfort and joy. This can be thought of as misfortune versus good fortune. So when you experience hardship, trials, tribulations, then this would be misfortunate, right? Versus good health, great career, your wealth, etc. That would be good fortune. And from the Buddhist perspective, but even as we read in the Exalted Treatise earlier on, we know that misfortune actually is derived from our own actions, our misdeeds, that then lead to demerits. But because from the Buddhist perspective, what happens to us is not just necessarily related to what we've done this life, but actually even from previous lives. And these previous lives are countless. So we don't actually know how many demerits we have accumulated from previous lives. So we don't know. And therefore, the misfortune that we're experiencing, why it is that, we have this particular, workplace environment, why it is we have this particular family, etc. These are all sort of based on what's happened in the past. Similarly, the good fortune results from our own good deeds, so our own actions, words, and thoughts as well, which then leads to merits over time. And again, good deeds from not just what we've done this life, but also in the past countless lives as well. So again, we have accumulated some good deeds, but also we accumulated merits, but also we have accumulated demerits. So actually, we come to this human life, in the human realm. All of us are born with certain demerits and merits in this life. From the moment we're born, we have demerits and merits, and a way of a certain amount of good fortune that we will experience, as well as a certain amount of misfortune that we will experience. And a good analogy is that of perhaps a bank account. So we're born in this life with some debt, that's a demerit, that we have to repay. But at the same time, we are born with some savings. Okay, so everyone comes to this life with debt and with some savings. Therefore, misfortune and good fortune. Now, not everyone doesn't have the same amount of debt or savings, misfortune or good fortune. That's very obvious, isn't it? Let's take the example of perhaps a child born into a war-torn country. From the moment that they are born, they're on the, they're displaced, they're on the run. Their life is constantly being threatened. Perhaps even their family is split apart, and they because of the war conditions, they don't receive any education. Then later in life, they are a refugee to another country. They migrate to another country, and therefore, but because they're older, they can't really go through education anymore. They have to work in perhaps a job that requires physical labor. And therefore you can see that this particular person perhaps came to this life with more debt than perhaps savings. So, from the moment they're born, they're actually, suffering misfortune. Versus another child who's born in perhaps, a millionaire's family, let's say in Australia, a country with, a public healthcare system, with a good sort of welfare system as well, education that is compulsory, good public education system, and if they go through all of the that government regulated education, etc., then they will have at least have a good career, etc., and be able to be a professional at some point. So clearly, that child perhaps came to this world with more savings, but that's not to also say that they don't have some debt. So everyone, it's part of this human condition that we have these debts and we have these savings, using this analogy. And so, any person who is, understands this principle, the Buddhist explanation of the realities of life, would think about perhaps first repaying the debts. So this idea of repaying debt, let's get that out of the way before we start enjoying the savings. So in the perspective of that line from the Exalted Treatise of leisure, amusement beyond measure, that would be when we are simply enjoying our good fortune, all these savings, and then when it's all used up, and in the process we may have accumulated demerits, misdeeds. When we have good wealth, power, privilege, we abuse that. Therefore, we accumulate demerits, which then leads to misfortune as opposed to more good fortune. So the Buddhist perspective then is quite all-encompassing, because it sort of doesn't just tell you about, okay, well, just curb the enjoyment of good fortune, but actually the fact that we have to realize that good fortune could lead to misfortune, because it's how we deal with it. So it's important to, from this perspective, then it's important to embrace any misfortune that we encounter, anything that doesn't go our way, to think of it with the right attitude. And I'll go into that in a bit of detail later. And when it comes to having good fortune, whether that's health, wealth, any kind of leisure, entertainment, etc., that we have to keep it in check. We have to make sure that while we do, enjoy ourselves at some point, take a break from work, etc., have a holiday, take our leave, but we do so in a way that is not detrimental to others or the environment. We are thinking of others at the same time. So that's this idea. Enjoying leisure and amusement, not enjoying leisure and amusement beyond measure. The idea from a Buddhist perspective then is, yes, we do have our good fortune, but we should use it wisely. When we experience any misfortune, think of it as repaying debt. And the secret to this is to think of it as a form of giving. Giving to someone who is giving to others, but to those who are in need, because these people are in need of, perhaps something that we've done in the past. They are in need. They're coming to reclaim that, to claim that debt from us, as opposed to other people. And we think, when you think of it as giving, perhaps it's more comforting, and it helps you think about how it is you can help that person to the best of your ability, rather than simply feeling that you've been wronged in any way. Okay, so I'll leave this discussion for now, but we will revisit this later in a bit of detail, because it does relate to some later sentences. So I'm going to move on to the following lines, which actually sort of develops this idea, because as you can see here, it talks about the misdeed of harassing and bullying subordinates, threatening and intimidating others, which happens if you have a position of power and privilege. So this is, when you're experiencing good fortune. And if you don't use it wisely, then here are the various misdeeds and therefore demerits that you can accumulate. So the difference between the first two sentences is, in the first one, it's just to subordinates, people who are in a position of less authority and power. The second sentence is threatening and intimidating anyone. It doesn't have to be just people who are your employees or your team members. So clearly, harassing and bullying others is, there's no excuse for that, regardless of whether you are their superior or not. And from the perspective of work relations, it actually makes the relations worse, strains the work relations, and there are ramifications not only for that particular person who feels pressured, bullied, but also it affects their work performance, and their work performance then directly affects the organization that you are in, of which you are a leader. So actually, the consequences come back onto you. If you are trying to create a high performing organization, well, harassing and bullying the subordinates, your employees, doesn't get you there. Now, clearly there are various ways in which this happens, but rather than focus on that, the Venerable Master's lecture sort of turns it back and explains that rather than being exacting and severe, this idea of harassing others, rather than doing that to others, doing that to subordinates, how we can make this positive and a good deed by turning it back on ourselves. How can we be more severe and demanding of ourselves? And this is what is not only from the Buddhist perspective, Taoist perspective, but particularly from the Confucian perspective, something that is part and parcel of, progressing in our cultivation. Our cultivation is to reflect on ourselves, to use the external conditions, whether it's what's happening around us, the work relations that we have, the subordinates that are not performing so well, that makes us angry, etc., and turn that back on ourselves and reflect on ourselves. There's a very famous Chinese proverb, and it says, to forgive others as we forgive ourselves. That would actually, preserve our friendships. We would have countless friends. And then to criticize others as we criticize ourselves as we criticize others, then, clearly we would be enlightened very, very soon. We would have fewer faults every day. So these two lines show us what it means to turn this back on ourselves. In other words, to reflect on ourselves. So, the idea of the magnifying glass is that, when we look at other people's faults, we have a magnifying glass, and we can see very clearly all of their various imperfections, particularly if they are your subordinate. All of their various lack of skills or knowledge, etc., their incompetencies. But very seldom do we turn that magnifying glass back on ourselves and reflect very clearly on what it is that we are not doing right to help in that relationship. So, to put this into perspective, and put it into practice, the idea of reflecting on ourselves, criticizing ourselves as we criticize others. Well, some of the common problems in a sort of employer-employee relationship, or a team leader, team member kind of relationship, is that perhaps you make too many demands on others as a team leader, right? And this may often be the case as well with any kind of subordinate kind of relationship. Could be elder sibling talking to a younger sibling, teacher-student kind of relationship, or parents demanding of their children, for example, etc., etc. So it doesn't just relate to employers and employees. So perhaps there's a criticism of others that they're too slow. But if we turn that around and criticize ourselves, were we too slow in telling them the task? Did we give them enough time to prepare? And when we did provide some sort of deadline, was it realistic? Would I do that to myself? Say, I want X, Y, Z, and I want it today, this afternoon. If you did set if we did set a realistic deadline, did we provide milestones so that the person knew how to work to certain outcomes, rather than just a huge goal? If you set an assignment, what are the things that they have to prepare, the students might have to prepare as they work towards that rather large project? And on top of that, did I give these team members enough time to find me, to approach me, to discuss their issues, things that might have been setting them back, keep preventing their progress? So that's, when we say someone's too slow, then think about and reflect on, what have I done that could have helped them work faster? Another common complaint is that of lack of attention to detail. They're quite sloppy with their work. I told them to do X, Y, Z. It comes back with so many mistakes. Well, the question is, when we set that task, provided that instruction, did we lack attention to detail in providing that instruction? Were the details clear? This is what I want you to do. These are the things that I expect. And, this is what the finished product would look like. So you always have to be, almost 10 steps ahead of the game. You have to know what the finished product looks like. in some way so that you can motivate them towards it and give them enough detail, but also space to be creative, to, I guess, surpass your expectations. So this, if the person lacks attention to detail, perhaps we need to be more detailed in our instructions, at least in the first time we give these sets of instructions. And then maybe next time, if it's the same project, they'll know what to do if they recorded it this time. So make sure that, the instructions that you provide, not just in terms of the task, but also how it is that they're going to work. Perhaps if things need to be recorded, where are you keeping the record? Can I see that record, etc., etc. Then another very common complaint when it comes to employees is perhaps they lack certain skills or knowledge for the job. They're in this area that they're not performing so well. But actually, was that part of the job description that I set? Or am I sort of demanding too much in a junior position? And on top of that, have I given them time for their continual professional development, for their own training, personal development, to skill themselves? If it's not part of the organizational training, then have I given them time for their own personal training, as well as, their leave, entitlement, etc. So you can see these are just some simple examples of how we can, if we keep criticizing making the same points, criticism, but the message is not getting through to the other person, regardless of how we communicate, then oftentimes we have to reflect back on ourselves. So to criticize ourselves as we criticize others is this kind of idea. And I guess part of this idea is then to think back as to, what were my difficulties when I was in their position, when I was in that junior position? What is it that I can share with them? What experiences, training, knowledge, skills that I can share with them so that they can be better prepared generally, and not just in relation to these particular faults. But more importantly, criticizing ourselves is reflecting on how I have performed as a leader. Now, from the Confucian perspective, the leader actually has not just the task of setting the agenda and the strategy, the 10-year plan, but also teaching and also caring for them, for your team members. So it's much more holistic than simply providing a salary, say. And part of that is this idea of motivating others. And I take this extract from something that many of us are familiar with, Deeds of Gui, that it says that when you interact with people, we should inspire others. What am I doing that might inspire their respect? We have to be dignified, but also we have to be kind and generous with others. And more importantly, we have to provide sound reasoning. We have to, just like this photo, we have to provide them with the greater goal, the greater strategy, so that, it's not just about walking the few steps ahead, but actually, what is the long-term plan and how it is that we can get there. So this is something that actually motivates them on all fronts, whether it's skills, knowledge, the performance, etc. And it's through that reflection on ourselves as leaders that we realize, okay, well, maybe it's not just the employees, but the junior staff, etc. But also perhaps it is something that is missing in how I communicate and what I communicate. And so therefore, this greater goal, this idea of inspiring respect, but providing just simple inspiration is so important. And so you can see that, yes, the Exalted Treatise provides us with the misdeed of being harassing and bullying others. But actually, when we think about it at a deeper level, we can use it in a positive sense of turning it back around and saying, well, yes, I'm bullying others. Why? Because I think maybe they're incompetent. And then, well, why is it that they might be incompetent? Let's look at how I might help them. And you realize that you can improve yourself too. So I guess that's the mindset we have to have. The other sentence that was related was to threaten and intimidate others. The collected commentaries explains that there are two cases in which that might occur. The first is when the other person is in a vulnerable position. They're in a they're in a time of need, but rather than lending a hand, we actually use that their vulnerability, their weakness, to intimidate them and get what we want. The second case is simply when we want to pursue our own self-interests, and therefore we threaten others. So, clearly this is misdeed, but I also want to point out that this threatening or this intimidating may not necessarily be overt. It could be covert, in the sense that you threaten others with, perhaps criticizing or humiliating them to their superiors, to people who have influence and therefore may prevent their career progress or advancement. And perhaps you have, a history of making things up so that people might be afraid of you. So this is a more sort of insidious way of threatening others. But it is still a misdeed, even though it's not sort of in your face. So I think this is really quite obvious. So I won't labor the point. We'll move on to the next set of lines, which in some way relates back to the earlier lines. So they are to blame heaven and others, and to rage against, complain against, unseasonable winds and rain. So this weather pattern. It's just like the photo here. You can imagine the person going, oh gosh, the wind's so strong, my umbrella's just been broken, I'm drenched, poor me, why is it raining today? Getting annoyed at the weather. It's something that, I'm sure we've all experienced. Now, in Chinese, there's an ancient saying that 80 to 90% of life does not go our way. 80 to 90% of life does not go our way. So actually, you can, only 10% of the times are things really going smoothly in our lives. And this is, and that's why, why blame others? Why blame heaven? You think there are things that you can't control. But this is very common. And as you can see, the Exalted Treatise was written in the 12th century. So it's not just something that, people do in the modern society, that we blame others. Let's say, for example, people who are given a diagnosis of cancer. Their first question will be, why me? And then there may be this kind of blame against some greater power, or even blaming others. So this reaction, we might think it's common, but actually what's interesting here is the Exalted Treatise is telling us that it's a misdeed. Right? It's not just, a common reaction, everyone does it. We just blame others all the time for things that go wrong in our lives. Actually, it's a misdeed. And that's so interesting because we wouldn't think of that, that blaming others or blaming the heavens. You could do it secretly. You don't have to necessarily shout out at someone, but keep it inside yourself. That in itself is a misdeed. Now, why that is the case, the best way of explaining it is to go back to that Buddhist perspective. So the idea that, this is copied from the earlier slide, the idea of sorrow and calamity that we experience, the idea of misfortune, actually is a result of our own actions. Misdeeds, so actions, thoughts, words, etc. Misdeeds in the past, current life or past lives, that then lead to demerits. And therefore, that's why we are experiencing things that are going wrong in our lives right now. And, this misdeed, there's various forms, okay? So it could be poor health, some sort of diagnosis. It could be a loss of property. Something's happened in your life, you have to pay a lot of expenses, fees, etc. Something happening to your family or your loved ones or friends makes you feel sad. So it's not just about loss of wealth or property. It's actually misfortune could be various things. And when you experience that, regardless, even if there is a clear perpetrator, say for example, you've had setbacks in your project at work, and clearly it's because of a colleague who is sort of backstabbing you, trying to create obstacles, etc. Even if you are very sure, all the evidence is there, there's this perpetrator to, your work project or your career advancement, you still cannot blame others. It is still a misdeed. And the reason is because, as you can see here in the few words on this slide, that actually everything that we experience, whether it's the people, the matters, the weather that we experience, what happens to our body, there's kind of all the various forms of misfortune, things that are not going our way, are the result of our own misdeeds. Our own misdeeds and not the misdeeds of others. And this is, the theories, it's very detailed when we read the consciousness only school of Buddhism. And I have the picture of a plant here with fruit, because basically is the idea that these misdeeds, whatever thought, word, and deed, are like seeds that are planted in our consciousness. This consciousness is not medical, like the medical consciousness, but a deeper consciousness that contains all of the seeds of all our lifetimes, current and previous. They're called seeds. And over time, just like any seed, it needs the right conditions, sunlight, water, soil. It will grow. So it might not be immediate, but it will, the consequences will occur. And just like this plant here, it will grow, it will bear fruit. The fruit is this so-called misfortune that we are experiencing. So blaming others for, as you can see, imagine if this plant sprung up in your backyard and, it's got this fruit that is poisonous. Well, actually, you forgot that you actually planted that seed a while ago. So you cannot blame anyone else. We cannot blame anyone else for these fruits that are poisonous or that are sour or whatever. But actually, it's because of our own actions. And I think that's quite easy to understand using that analogy as well. Now, rather than thinking about this as something that's very, a passive way of living, things just happen to me and I just have to accept it. Well, actually, this is quite a proactive way of thinking, a proactive attitude to life, because it's telling you that there's no use crying over spilt milk. What's happening around us is actually the result of what's already done. And we can't change the past. What we can change is how we respond. What are the seeds that we are planting now? Right? How can we move on from this? How can we build a better life? So when we say that we can change our fate, our destiny, that's what we mean. How we respond to the current events, whether it's good fortune, great friends, etc., great career, or misfortune, some sorrow, sad things in our lives, poor health. How we respond to that actually creates our future. So here it is in a flowchart, which might help you think about it. So let's look at this misdeed that we talked about before, enjoying ourselves beyond measure, having this dissolute lifestyle. We're indulging ourselves, being extravagant. This obviously leads to demerits. We will experience misfortune. For example, we use up all of our property, wealth. We experience poverty. When we experience poverty, what happens? Or this misfortune, what happens often is that we blame others. Oh, it was this friend. He taught me to gamble away these shares, etc. He or she taught me, to how to buy, luxury items, and it's become addictive, etc. So you blame others, and that also in itself, as we saw, is a misdeed. So therefore, you develop or accumulate demerits, which then later leads to more misfortune. For example, you're blaming others, so you're rejected by friends, you're a loner, etc. So you can see it's this vicious cycle. You go from one thing to the other without even realizing that it's one misdeed after the other, and you're just accumulating these demerits. Okay, well, how do we break that cycle? Okay, so we're experiencing whatever it is that we're experiencing right now, whether it's health, poor health, relationships that are strained, conditions, etc. How do we break that cycle? Well, here's another kind of way of thinking about it. If you follow my arrow here, rather than responding to the misfortune by blaming others, by you could say bullying or harassing others to get your way, to get more money, to cheat others, etc. So all of the things that we've already discussed in the third section on misdeeds. Rather than doing all of that, we can look to doing some good deeds. We respond to the situation by being grateful with every person who has helped us in some way, and perhaps for people who have helped us spend all our money. We're also grateful because they've taught us the value of money now that we've fallen on hard times. So don't blame others. Be grateful. That's one way of responding. Obviously, there are many other ways, but this is just an example. Everything in the brackets is just an example. So and then through that, we are planting the good seeds, the good deeds. When we do that, so clearly this is even just a thought. Okay? It doesn't maybe translate into any action yet. We don't need to make any donations or anything like that, but it's still a good deed through our thoughts. We accumulate merits. Through these merits, we experience good fortune in the future. For example, we might get a good reputation for being a kind person, etc. We use this good fortune not to enjoy ourselves, but to help others succeed. And help them in sharing our ideas, sharing our experiences, etc. So this is a good deed. We use our good fortune, maybe we have some good reputation, to help others learn about the realities of life, for example. Through these good deeds, we accumulate more merits, which then leads to more good fortune, such as good friends. And then, obviously, if we have the right attitude to life, our life just gets better and better, right? You can see that here. We've broken the cycle because we've responded in a different way. So yes, we may experience misfortune, but we have to respond in the right way rather than blaming others. And similarly, the Exalted Treatise or these ancient texts will tell us that when we experience any good fortune, we have to use that to do good rather than accumulate misdeeds and demerits. So we can't blame others. We simply use this as an opportunity to accumulate merit by responding in the right way. And that response comes about through our understanding of the realities of life. This idea that actually everything that happens to us is because of something we've done in the past. Now, that cannot be changed, but what we can change is right here, right now, how we respond through our thoughts, our words, and ultimately our actions. And so, the other idea of raging against unseasonable winds and rain, you can see, clearly why these two sentences are juxtaposed, is because, again, this is not something that we can control. And in fact, Mother Nature should be revered and respected. The Collected Commentaries takes a line from the Records on Ritual, which talks about how the noble people in the past, noble persons is not necessarily someone of aristocracy or power, but someone who has developed their character. How do they react when they experience some violent winds, windy weather, thunder, lightning, and stormy weather? So what they do is they change their countenance. They become more respectful. They don't become scared and frightened or annoyed and complain, but actually they become more respectful and more serious. And even if it's the middle of the night, they get up, dress themselves in formal wear, put on their cap. Often people put on their caps in those days when guests come, when they go out. So this is sort of, to be quite respectful and serious. And they sit up until this, weather event passes. So you can see that, the way they respond is different because actually they might be scared, but they know that that doesn't change anything. What might change the situation is their response to the adverse weather event. This idea of respect and reverence. And of course, from the Buddhist perspective, if you encounter this kind of adverse weather patterns, natural sort of, disasters, then it's important to pray, to meditate. So it's almost the same idea that we shouldn't complain, but rather it's about controlling our current response, our current thoughts to the situation at hand. So these are the sentences that we've covered today. You can see that they are related. The idea of enjoying leisure and amusement beyond measure is sort of making sure that we preserve and grow our good fortune, grow our savings, and not use that power and privilege, this good fortune, to harass and bully others, to threaten and intimidate them, but rather to keep check on ourselves, to what is it that we are annoyed at with others, and how can we change ourselves so that we can help them change the situation. And the final sentences that we cover today are part of the next section of misdeeds, which is this idea that you have to act with reverence. Okay, so in the first misdeed in this section, this subsection, is to act with reverence towards things that you can't control. So God, this greater power, this heaven, others. Don't blame others for things that, misfortune. And particularly don't complain about the weather, because again, that's not something we can control. What we can control is our response. So it's living life with the right attitude, an attitude that's positive, proactive, and also develops yourself for right now, but also for the future to better your life in many ways. So thank you for listening, and look forward to exploring this with you next week as well. Thank you so much.